exactly the same amount of gold coins today to buy a house as you would have needed in 1953. Gold, you don't get rich on gold. Gold holds the purchasing value. Now, before you rush out and buy gold, which if you've got any spare liquidity is not a bad idea perhaps, but go check that out for yourself. But gold fluctuates quite wildly, sometimes on a daily basis. So you don't go into gold for the short term, because one day you could be in ecstasy and the next day you'll be having a coronary. Gold is a long-term hold on the basis that you are protecting the purchasing power of your assets. Gold is being forecast to hit $2,000 an ounce by the end of this year. Silver has potentially even more upside, because JP Morgan are fighting a case right now because it is alleged that JP Morgan have oversold their silver holdings by as much as 100 to 1. And if that's proven to be the case, then of course the silver is going to absolutely rocket. Now, of course, we're all being told right across Western Europe that, we're in this world of hurt, we're all in it together, and we've got to accept these austerity budgets. Well, this is what all in it together means when you're the Chief Executive Officer of Goldman Sachs, the architects of the current financial meltdown. This is an article from the Sunday Times a little over 15 months ago. And in that article, Lloyd Blankfein said that as the head of Goldman Sachs, he felt that he was doing God's work. God's work. Well, for doing God's work, in 2007, his earnings were $70.4 million. And in 2008, when the market... I don't know how the guy survived. I have no idea how he managed to avoid bankruptcy. Because in 2008, his earnings fell to 1.1 million. In 2009, the fake recovery, his earnings went back up to 64 million. And then last year, at 13.2 million. His base salary is 600,000. The rest is bonus, stock options, pension. Now, the reason I say the fake recovery here is because that was the lure, to lure people back into the investment markets. Lure people out of gold and get them back into the stock markets or back into the banks. Because when money is in gold, it means they can't abuse it. So they need the money back. So that's why they will drop the price of gold dramatically every now and again, so that people who've bought gold panic, sell it, and the money goes back into their hands. Now, we're in a situation right now which absolutely mirrors the period 1929 to 1933. And in 1929, it wasn't the 1929 crash that destroyed people's wealth. It was the second crash of 1933. And some concern in the US is that because in March of 1933, the banksters, JP Morgan, Junius Pierre Morgan, and the then head of the Federal Reserve, Eugene Meyer, instructed President Edgar Hoover, to confiscate all gold of American citizens. And they were required to turn their gold in under penalty of 10 years imprisonment.
I thought that was Roosevelt.
No. It wasn't Roosevelt. It was indeed Edgar Hoover. Roosevelt was waiting in the wings. So there's the risk, and a lot of pundits are expressing concern that if gold does hit $2,000 an ounce by the end of the year, the American government may once again repeat that and actually confiscate its citizens' gold. So Americans buying gold, they're buying it in Mexico, smuggling it back across the border, so there's no record of them holding any gold, and then they're just burying it in the ground. Okay. So this guy, over the years, the world has gone to hell in a handbasket as the global economy is brought into a manipulated financial meltdown. This guy has been very well rewarded for managing that process. That's why, all of the bankers, with the exception of Iceland, all of the bankers are being extremely well rewarded with bonuses. because they did exactly what they were instructed to do. It's only us who are led to believe that nobody ever saw it coming, and they couldn't help it. Here's why the Irish gas or hydrocarbon reserves are so important. Because the vast majority of our reserves in the Eastern Hemisphere are in this area here. And at the moment, the North Sea is not yielding as much as it was 20 odd years ago, so we're having to import. But the bulk of the reserves lie here. And that's why they want to make sure that they're in their hands and not yours. There's another factor here as well, because this is the strategy of the neocons. This is a document, you can see when it was published by the Council on Foreign Relations here, June 2001. And it was talking here about the fact that America needs to secure global oil resources. It needs an excuse to launch a campaign to secure the oil resources elsewhere in the world. Here's the quote from forward. It says, the American people need to know about this situation, the fact that it needs to get hold of the oil, and be told as well there are no easy or quick solutions to today's energy problems. The President has to begin educating the public about this reality and start building a broad base of popular support for the hard policy choices ahead. Notice the date. 3 months before 9/11. Well, that provided exactly the catalyst that they needed to launch their campaign of global hegemony to get into Iraq. And why did they want to go into Iraq? Because the dictator, Saddam Hussein, would not play ball with them. Saddam Hussein was intent on retaining ownership of Iraq's massive resources for the benefit of the Iraqi people. The Iraqi education system, the Iraqi health system were of the highest calibre in the Middle East, up until, even despite the sanctions. And even though he was limited on the amount of oil he could export, but he was exporting it in euros, which was also pissing off the United States, because he was exporting it in euros. And one of the reasons for the attack on Iraq was to loot the Iraqi banks of their euro holdings. Oil companies are making record $100 billion annual profits, not because oil is scarce, but because we believe it is. Now, the reason that the Americans want to control all the world's oil actually has nothing at all to do with the perception that they're running out of oil, because they're not at all. The reason that the US wants to control, the UN via the US is effectively the UN's police force and army, the reason they want to control all of the world's oil supply is so that they can control the price. There is no free market here. And the reason the price is so important to the US is because, at the moment at least, oil is still ostensibly traded in the petrodollar. And the petrodollar is the means by which you create a global economy. To create a global economy, everybody's got to have money to spend. Well, prior to 1973, there really wasn't that much money in and around the world. So Kissinger and James A. Baker III, along with the banks, decided that they would stimulate the global economy by pumping US dollars into the oil-producing countries. And the way in which they would do that is hike the price. So Kissinger and James A. Baker III hatched a plan that they would use the 1973 Israel-Arab War to tell OPEC that they wanted to hike the price by 400%. So it had nothing to do with the OPEC countries. It was Kissinger and Baker that wanted the price hike because they wanted to pump more dollars into the global market. Because there's two ways in which you can put dollars into the market. One is what they do with Israel, which is give it. And the US gives Israel $3.6 billion every year, which is, ironically, exactly the amount of money that they give to Saudi Arabia through buying oil. And they give, by putting this money into those other countries, those countries can then spend it on arms produced by the US. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. The other part of the mythology that is still believed generally throughout the West is that oil is a finite resource. Peak oil, a myth. Peak oil is a construct. It's a political construct to create the perception of scarcity. Because if you believe something is scarce, you will psychologically be quite happy to pay a higher price for it. Where is the evidence in the world that there's a shortage of oil? There isn't. You know, and in reality, we don't even need to be consuming oil at the rate it's being produced. Right now, oil is produced at the rate of about 88 million barrels a day. We definitely do not need to be consuming that amount. Okay? The technology has existed for at least 30 years where every car on the road could be returning 100 miles a gallon. That technology is deliberately suppressed because the oil companies have an infrastructure that produces 88 billion barrels of oil a day, therefore they need to sell it. Governments want to sell it because they want the tax that's associated with it. You know, the Western economies are supposedly in a world of hurt right now, thanks to the artificially created debt and the fact that the interest on those debts can't be serviced. Imagine how bad it would be if the oil being purchased, the amount of oil being purchased in those countries was half of what is being sold right now. The price of a litre would have to go up even higher because it's the only other means these guys have got of collecting money. The Russians have had a completely different philosophy of exploration, production and reservoir management for nearly 50 years. And there have been over 5,000 academic papers written about oil, this is in Russia, about oil being an abiotic fluid. Now this is a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis. But so is the point that's accepted as fact that oil is a fossil fuel. Any self-respecting geologist who is still capable of critical thinking will tell you that they don't really know that oil is a fossil fuel. That is simply the orthodoxy that is shared at college. And we can actually trace it back. We can trace this belief back to a guy called Mikhailo Lomonosov, who in 1757 made the observation that he thought oil was a rock oil, and from that point forward it very quickly became sort of the belief that it was a fossil fuel. The Russians don't believe that for 1 minute, and they don't bleed their wells dry. They monitor the pressure within their wells very, very closely. Oh, it's the air conditioning. They monitor the pressure of their wells very, very closely. And as the pressure of the well drops, they cap the well. And they leave it in fallow. I mean, just take a farmer. Leaves a field in fallow. They leave the well in fallow. They monitor the pressure in the reservoir. And as the pressure builds back up, they go back into those wells. And Western oil companies know this, but it's deliberately suppressed because we need to maintain the myth that oil is a finite resource so that people are prepared to pay outrageous sums of money for it. So consider what the reality is in terms of the real reserves off the coast of Ireland. I mean, we're not talking a few trillion here.